Government borrowing has become the primary engine of the world, and that engine is overheating. Governments across the globe aren't just borrowing. They are hopelessly addicted to debt. The single most dangerous issue in modern finance isn't visible on the nightly news. It is lurking in the ledgers of the state. We are watching sovereign debt levels undergo a mutation. They haven't just grown, they have expanded exponentially, defying gravity. In the so-called developed world, the average ratio of public debt to GDP has climbed all the way back to the levels of 1945. Think about that. We are operating with World War II levels of leverage, but without the excuse of a world war. That fact alone should be enough to wake you up. The terrifying truth they won't tell you? It is politically impossible to solve. This exploding debt is a ticking time bomb. If you are an investor with your eyes open, the worry starts to gnaw at you. You have to ask, what happens next? Is a default inevitable? The music always stops eventually. And when a major crisis hits, the silence is devastating. The question that haunts the corridors of power is simple. At what point does the bond market finally break? They are desperate to keep the bond yields from rising. They cannot afford to let the yield crush the economy. Because if that happens, the Bond Vigilantes, the enforcers of the market, will have taken their vengeance on a system that thought it could cheat math forever. Make no mistake, a determined central bank can trample over reality. They can override market pressure if they choose to. But if you are holding bond investments, you should be terrified. Let's look at the ugly face of reality. The entire world is hooked on debt. It is a systemic disease. Almost every nation, leaving the Germans aside for a moment, is drowning in borrowed money. We have been conditioned to accept this as normal. We have normalized the insanity of governments borrowing enormous, incomprehensible amounts of money relative to their economic output. Look at the roster of the indebted: the United States, Japan, Canada, Italy, France. All these pillars of Western civilization are carrying debt loads that are historically dangerous. Wherever you turn your gaze, you see the rot of government deficits. The U.S. is running a deficit of roughly 7% of GDP. China, behind its Great Wall of Secrecy, is also running a massive deficit. It is a playbook they have been running since the global financial crisis. The strategy is simple and suicidal. You borrow your way out of trouble. And how do you pay for that borrowing? You borrow more. We are trapped in a cycle with no exit. The biggest economies on Earth have no way out. We are back to 1945, staring into the abyss. A great deal of this mess is blamed on shocks. It's the perfect excuse. First, the global financial crisis. Then, the pandemic. Then, war returning to Europe. And each time, governments stepped in, claiming they had to be the insurers of last resort. They printed, they spent, they saved the system. But following the pandemic, the bill arrived. A global spike in inflation. Interest rates punching through the roof. This changed the math entirely. It means much more expensive debt servicing costs. The interest alone is becoming a leviathan. Debt to GDP levels are hovering around 100%. These economies owe as much as they produce in a year. And the projections? They only go up. They rise and rise until the situation becomes explosive. Olivier Blanchard, a man who spent his life at MIT and the IMF, dealing with the wreckage of 2008 and the Euro crisis, puts it bluntly: these countries are addicts. And this disease can strike any nation at any time. Ray Dalio, the founder of Bridgewater and arguably the most successful hedge fund manager in history, sees the mechanics of the trap. When debts pile up, interest payments pile up. This service payment starts to squeeze out everything else. It eats the budget alive. The death spiral begins when you have to borrow money just to pay the interest on the money you already borrowed. Bonds are nothing but an IOU, a government promise. They say to the investor, "Give me cash now, and I will give it back later." In the interim, they feed you scraps called coupons. But because there are thousands of different bonds with different maturity dates and coupons, it's hard to see the full picture. To understand the danger, we have to look at the yields. Here is the iron law: yields go up when prices go down. Governments are terrified of yields going up too fast. If they do, borrowing costs skyrocket for everyone in the country. That is why they need a bedrock of buyers. They need support. One man's debt is another man's asset. For the system to function, holding that debt must look attractive. But then comes the debt death spiral. This is when worry turns into panic, when selling begets more selling. The drumbeat of warning is getting louder. We have seen episodes, glitches in the matrix, where investors simply stopped buying. They went on strike. That is when the politicians start to sweat. Karen Ward from JP Morgan hears it from clients every day. Government borrowing is the #1 fear. We were told a lie. We were told government debt was the safe haven, the bedrock, the boring part of the portfolio that keeps you safe at night. But Greg Peters from PGM Fixed Income knows the truth. The enemy is inflation. Bonds hate inflation. It is kryptonite to them. They cannot survive it because it devours their real returns. In a world where inflation shocks are the new normal, the role of government bonds as a safety net is an illusion. There are times when debt is justified. Wars. Survival. But what we are seeing now is not that. It is a tomorrow is another day attitude. A reckless procrastination. The world got addicted to debt because for a long time, debt was free. We emerged from a bizarre world of zero or negative interest rates that encouraged nothing but gluttony. Stephanie Kelton, a professor and a voice for a different way of thinking, walks into rooms full of investment bankers and hedge fund managers. She polls them. Who thinks we should reduce the budget deficit? Almost every hand goes up. Who is worried about the national debt? Every hand goes up. Then she shows them the graph. The U.S. government has run deficits for her entire life. But she flips the script. She argues that the government's red ink is actually the private sector's black ink. She claims that if you eliminate the government deficit, you wipe out the private sector's surplus. She says the deficit is useful because it allows the rest of us to save. It is a seductive argument. But Russell Napier, the keeper of financial history, points to a darker reality. You cannot just look at the government. You have to look at the private sector too. If the government was in debt, but the people were prudent, maybe we could survive. But private borrowing is just as diseased. History shows that really big private busts eventually cause an explosion of government debt. The state always ends up holding the bag. After the financial crisis, until the pandemic, the fear was deflation. Inadequate demand. That was a world where monetary policy was aggressively stimulating the beast. But now, the beast has awoken. Inflation is back. The pressure is strong. And in the political system, the hunger for spending never ends. When you can hand things out on credit, why wouldn't you? It feels better. Credit produces debt. For a decade, they tried to cut back on public services, austerity. But that just created a new problem. Public infrastructure is crumbling. Now, the pressure is on governments to make up for the lost decade. Look at the forces bearing down on us. Weak growth means weak tax revenues. We are gambling with World War III. In a more dangerous world, defense spending is going to become a massive priority. We have an aging population draining the coffers. We have a green transition that requires trillions in support. And we are doing all of this with interest rates much higher than before. The burden is heavier. We have reached a point where it is normal for governments to borrow at a crisis pace every single year. In a low inflation world, you can get away with this robbery. Bond investors will fund you forever. But in a world where inflation stays high, that is when time runs out. Supply and demand are crashing into each other. The bond market used to be the ultimate judge, the arbiter of fiscal responsibility. The Bond Vigilantes would step in and force politicians to focus. Ed Yardeni, who coined the term back in 1983, remembers. In the 1970s, bond investors were slaughtered. Inflation soared, yields spiked, and they lost everything. He argued then that if authorities didn't maintain discipline, the vigilantes would take over. They would push yields up until the economy broke, forcing inflation down. We don't want yields to crush the economy, because if that happens, the vigilantes will have taken their vengeance. We watched debt rise for years without the vigilantes stopping it. Until the UK in 2022. The bond markets decided the Liz Truss government was incompetent. The UK gave a gift to the world, a demonstration of what happens when you push the market too far. Truss said she was a fighter, not a quitter. The market disagreed. It was a Liz Truss moment. She and her chancellor blew up the gilts market. Prices collapsed. Aggressive selling triggered a death loop. The Bank of England had to step in to steady the sinking ship. Governments around the world live in dread of that moment. Because when it happened, borrowing costs for everyone, mortgages, loans, went through the roof. The bond market matters because it hits the average household directly in the wallet. The UK is front and center, but let's not lose perspective. The UK isn't in a crisis right now like it was then. The current government inherited a tight ship, but the pressure to spend is immense. The real question, the elephant in the room, is the big boy, the United States. The US has the biggest deficit and completely unsustainable debt profiles. When do the vigilantes turn their guns on America? The US is the heart of the issue, the linchpin of the global economy. Its bond market is the foundation of all value. But look at the numbers. Worst-case scenarios project a debt-to-GDP ratio of 160% in 10 years. That is an eye-popping, staggering number. The U.S. federal government spent $880 billion on debt interest last year alone. That is 4 times the level of a decade ago. They spend more on interest than on the military, almost as much as on health. If you pay for debt by issuing more debt, you are vulnerable. A rise in interest rates is fatal. It is approaching 25% of all revenues just to pay back the debt service. That is the classic debt trap. It is a hole you cannot dig out of. You cannot inflate your way out easily. The U.S. is running a deficit of 6% of GDP in peacetime with full employment. That is extraordinary. It is absolutely enormous. The trajectory is disturbing. Since the U.S. holds the world's reserve currency, this is everyone's problem. The projected amount of debt that must be sold to the market, 7.5% of GDP, is right at the precipice. Some say the solution is a bipartisan commitment to reduce it to 3%. Good luck with that. Others try to play word games. They say we have a linguistic problem. They want to stop using words like deficit and debt because they sound bad. They want to call it a net contribution. They want to call the debt a cumulative net contribution. They think if they change the label on the poison bottle, the poison turns into wine. They think the temperature would come down if people just understood that the fight is over our savings account. Then comes the political theater. The Trump administration realizes they need to satisfy the bond vigilantes. So, suddenly, we have the DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency. They claim they will address the deficit. We have a $2 trillion deficit. If we don't act, the country goes bankrupt. Elon Musk is supposed to head this effort. He claims he can find enormous savings. But the experts are skeptical. Very skeptical. Is there really enough fat to trim to offset the tax cuts they also promise? Musk blurted out $2 trillion in cuts during the campaign. Even he has backed off that number. It is unlikely that Musk or anyone else can reduce spending enough to matter without causing a revolt. It would take a hiccup in the bond markets, a terrifying moment in the Treasury market, to actually force Congress to be responsible. The U.S. is crucial. The dollar is the currency of trade, of cross-border debt. People in other countries, central banks, big investors, they need to hold dollars. That means they need to buy U.S. government debt. It is the benchmark safe asset for the entire planet. This demand has enabled the U.S. government to be more reckless than any other. It is an exorbitant privilege. But maybe the type of crisis we saw in the UK or in the Eurozone a decade ago could finally come for the American bond market. If the economy at the center of the world cracks, it could be the most significant financial event of our lives. It could trigger destabilizing chaos everywhere. President Trump posts in all caps, balanced budget, but in the same breath, tax cuts and spending on the border. The math does not work. It is more likely than not that we will see large deficits continue until the bitter end. On the flip side, apologists point to Japan. They say, look at Japan. They have very high debt levels for a long time and nothing bad happened. But let's dissect Japan's success. Their high debt levels have been accompanied by economic stagnation. The central bank keeps interest rates at zero. They do quantitative easing, buying up all the debt. The debt doesn't really enter the market. The government buys its own lies. And the cost? The currency depreciates. The yen loses value every year. It has lost about 70% relative to U.S. bonds. It is a terrible deal for the holder. The bond vigilantes in Japan are the central bankers. They override market pressure. The unique thing about Japan is that the creditor is the Japanese people themselves. The corporate sector holds the debt at zero yields, despite inflation. It is a closed loop of obedience. The Bank of Japan is trusted. But even there, cracks can form. They have the most solvent, submissive creditors in the world, themselves. For the most part, this has been a Western problem. But look east. Look at China. People are now drawing parallels between China's economy today and Japan's 20 or 30 years ago. Demographics are collapsing. Populations are aging. Debt levels are skyrocketing. The debt in China is staggering. And because it is a closed system, they are not growing like they used to. The remedies are running out. Existential worries about debt are becoming an issue there too. And Europe? The Eurozone's finances look stronger on paper than the UK or US, but it is not a cohesive picture. Italy is one of the biggest borrowers in the area. France has a politically impossible time reining and spending. In France, they have to confront the deficit. But the political environment is toxic. They need to find $150 billion. That is absolutely impossible without a crisis. It may require the kind of market panic that forces people to sit down and accept the pain. And then, there is the new element. Germany. Germany was the poster child for limited spending. The black zero. The safest, most boring bond market on earth. That is over. Germany's chancellor reached a historic deal to spend hundreds of billions on defense and infrastructure. This is a seismic shift. The economy that refused to borrow is now belatedly joining the global debt party. They need domestic demand. Their private sector runs a huge surplus but generates no demand. Growth is slow. Infrastructure is rotting. And if you need a defense buildup for a potential war, you need to borrow. That is what governments are for. While the rest of the world spent freely, checks in the mail in the US, subsidies for industry in China, Germany held back. And they paid the economic price for their prudence. They are struggling to compete. Chinese electric vehicles, built on subsidies, are crushing them. The German consumer, who didn't get those stimulus checks, is cautious. They aren't spending. Investors have been crying out for Germany to borrow for a decade. Now that they are finally doing it, people assume it's great news. But remember, debt is not always bad, but addiction is. Italy is different. They have a high debt, but the prime minister is being fiscally responsible. Why? Because money from Brussels is conditional on good behavior. The Bond Vigilantes have never been potentially more powerful simply because there is so much debt in the system. Whether the politicians get the message is another story. We have to get deficits down so debt doesn't rise relative to incomes. If we don't, we face a high risk of a financial market heart attack. The problem is the lack of clarity. You can't say at X%, the market breaks. It's a fog of war. That uncertainty is what terrifies investors. You cannot hedge against a ghost. It may be a market impulse to go for a debt spiral, but governments will not permit it. These so-called vigilantes are betting on inflation. But Russell Napier has a darker prediction. The vigilantes will be assassinated. This is exactly what happened after World War II. We didn't allow the market to determine the price of credit. It may be a market impulse to go for a debt spiral, but governments will not permit it. These so-called vigilantes are betting on inflation. But Russell Napier has a darker prediction. The vigilantes will be assassinated. This is exactly what happened after World War II. We didn't allow the market to determine the price of credit. We forced people to buy government bonds. We kept yields at rates that any vigilante would consider obscene. This is called financial repression. Whether we live in democracies or dictatorships, the dictation will be to the vigilantes, not from them. The government will win. The market will be shackled. There is a debate among economists. Some say the bill is falling due and something bad is coming. Others say government finances are magic. You don't have to pay bills because you control the printing press. The problem with magic is that it is inflationary. There is no zero-cost way to sort this out. You could always stop issuing treasuries. It's a policy choice, not a law of physics. You don't need to get rid of debt. You just need to stabilize it at a level the population thinks is reasonable. Deficits can be useful when the economy crashes, but you need a surplus when times are good. We forgot that part. Public finances have to be sustainable. The wrong way to get there is a massive, sudden shock. That was the mistake of austerity. But if you simply say, let's borrow as much as we can, you destroy the private sector. There are those who say, just print the money. But there is a long, long history of how that ends in disaster. Any financial historian knows that direct government financing by the central bank leads to the death of the currency. But, and this is a big but, there are plenty of savings in the world. Your savings. The government is going to manipulate those savings to borrow more money. They will borrow it by forcing you to buy their bonds. They don't have to take the radical risk of hyperinflation immediately. They can abuse the savers long before they abuse the central bank's balance sheet. I can't see a way for governments to snap this reliance on debt. Countries with large deficits are going to go through brutal adjustments. Fiscal rules will come back, not because we want them, but because we have no choice. Panics are the worst thing you can do, unless you have an overwhelming crisis. Everyone wants more credit. Politicians love borrowing because the payback comes on someone else's watch. If you can increase spending without increasing taxes, that is political nirvana. The only problem is the bond vigilantes. Maybe they don't want it. Maybe they have the power to stop it. So we are in a big debt cycle. These cycles go on for 50 or 75 years. And we are nearing the end of one. Policymakers need to understand the mechanics of this cycle. Are there limits to debt? Yes, because the limit will come. Every deficit is good for someone. Is it a deficit for tax cuts for the rich? Or a deficit for infrastructure? They serve different masters. Inflating away the debt by stealth over many years might turn out to be the least worst option for the elites. It allows them to steal your wealth without making unpopular decisions. But higher inflation is dangerous. It leads to governments being thrown out of office. It leads to social unrest. Inflation has to be unexpected to work for them. If it is expected, yields go up and the trap snaps shut. I can't imagine a world without government debt. It has been a feature of economies for centuries. The Bank of England was created to manage the king's debt. They tell us the government is the soundest credit. They tell us there is nothing wrong with borrowing. They tell us it is part of what makes the modern system work. And that is exactly what they will keep telling us, right up until the moment the system stops working. The machine is hungry, and it is feeding on your future. We are walking on the edge of a razor. The debt is real. The addiction is terminal. And the proposed cures are just as deadly as the disease. Whether through the slow suffocation of financial repression or the sudden heart attack of a market crash, the adjustment is coming. The era of free money is over. The era of consequences has begun. The government will try to force you to pay for their party. They will come for your savings, your purchasing power, and your security. The question you need to answer is not if the collapse will happen, but where will you be standing when the dust settles? Don't be the one holding the bag. This is the reality they don't want you to see. Subscribe to the channel if you want to survive what comes next. And click the link in the description to learn how to protect your assets from the greatest wealth transfer in history. The clock is ticking.